The new VP branded my safety protocols costly frills. He sacked me, saving $50,000 annually. I packed my desk without a sound. You know, sometimes, people make decisions that are so spectacularly short-sighted, so utterly arrogant, that they practically write their own comeuppance. I'm Daniel, and for 11 years, I was the unseen guardian of the skies, keeping planes safe. They called my work expensive fluff. 3 weeks later, the entire fleet was grounded. And then the phone rang. The world I operated in was Ridgeline Regional Airlines, a modest operation based out of Colorado. 37 aircraft, a dozen routes weaving through the Mountain West and into California. Nothing flashy, just dependable service connecting smaller cities that the major players ignored. When I joined in 2013, it was a disaster waiting to happen. The previous compliance guy had retired, leaving behind a filing system that looked like a paper tornado. FAA reports scattered, maintenance logs contradicting each other. It was a regulatory nightmare. I spent my first 2 years living in that chaos, painstakingly rebuilding everything from scratch. I built a unified tracking system, digitized a decade of records, crafted inspection checklists that actually aligned with FAA mandates, and cultivated relationships with regional inspectors so they knew our operation was airtight. My work wasn't glamorous. It was methodical, precise. Every bolt logged, every inspection meticulously documented, every maintenance action recorded with timestamps and technician signatures. By year 3, Ridgeline wasn't just passing inspections, we were a model operation. The FAA even started sending other regional carriers to observe our processes. I testified at industry conferences, trade publications wrote about our transformation, and our insurance premiums dropped by a remarkable 18% because our safety record was that impeccable. Then came the real test in my 5th year. An engine inspection revealed a potential fatigue crack on an older aircraft. It could have been a catastrophic crisis, but I coordinated with the FAA, our maintenance team, and the manufacturer to develop an inspection protocol for every similar aircraft. We documented everything, kept regulators informed, and what could have been a disaster became a case study in proactive safety management. The FAA regional director sent me a personal letter afterward. I had it framed, hung it on my office wall. It praised our exemplary compliance practices that should serve as a model for the regional aviation industry. The owner, Arthur, was an old-school aviation man, a former pilot who'd started Ridgeline back in '87 with nothing but 2 planes and a prayer. He understood, deeply, that safety compliance wasn't just a cost, it was the bedrock that kept the entire operation from crumbling overnight. Every quarter, Arthur would call me into his office, review the metrics, shake my hand, and tell me I was the reason he could sleep soundly at night. Then, life took an unexpected turn. Arthur suffered a heart attack one Tuesday morning. He survived, but his flying days were over, and so was running the airline. His kids weren't interested, one was a dentist, the other in real estate, they just wanted cash. By June, Ridgeline was sold to Evergreen Aviation Holdings, a private equity group out of Denver. Their pitch was operational efficiency and strategic consolidation. What that really meant was slashing costs and squeezing margins until something, inevitably, broke. A transition team arrived in July, spending 3 weeks scrutinizing every department, asking endless questions about headcount and overhead, demanding justifications for every expense. They asked very few questions about safety records. Almost nothing about compliance history. They just wanted numbers, costs, margins. That should have been my first chilling warning sign. August brought Marcus Thorne, the new vice president of operations. Mid-40s, expensive suits, an MBA he referenced constantly. He'd spent his career in hospitality and retail before, somehow, landing in aviation. No aviation background, no regulatory experience, a total outsider. His first week, Marcus strode through the facility like he was inspecting a hotel, commenting on office layouts, questioning the coffee budget, and wondering why maintenance techs needed such substantial tool allowances. My one-on-one with Marcus was on a Thursday. I arrived with a 63-page binder, a comprehensive overview of our safety management system, inspection schedules, and documentation protocols. He glanced at it, pushed it aside without opening it, then leaned back with that patronizing executive smirk. "Daniel," he began, "I've been reviewing departmental budgets. Your area has some interesting numbers." I kept my face neutral. "Compliance overhead runs about $285,000 annually," I explained, factoring in my salary, the documentation specialist, software subscriptions, and third-party audit fees. "That's precisely what I wanted to discuss," he said, pulling up a spreadsheet. Previous ownership seemed to have a very generous interpretation of what compliance requires. "I think we can streamline significantly." "Streamline how?" I asked, my voice flat. "Well, for starters, do we really need a full-time compliance manager? Most of our competitors outsource this function." "Most of our competitors," I shot back, "have had aircraft grounded by the FAA in the last 5 years. We haven't." He waved a dismissive hand. "That's fear-based thinking. The aviation industry has matured. Regulations are standardized. We don't need someone sitting here full-time worrying about paperwork. The paperwork," I emphasized, "is what proves to federal regulators that our aircraft are safe to carry passengers. Without proper documentation, the FAA can ground planes on the spot." Marcus smiled, that infuriating, self-assured smile people use when they think they're intellectually superior. "I understand you're protective of your position, but Evergreen has acquired 6 regional carriers. We know how to optimize operations without compromising safety." I wanted to point out that "we've done this before" wasn't the same as "we've done this successfully," but I'd learned arguing with people who'd already made up their minds was a waste of precious energy. So, I simply asked if there was anything specific he needed me to prepare. "Actually, yes." His eyes lit up with predatory glee. "I need a complete inventory of every compliance function you perform. Every task, every hour spent, every dollar allocated. I want to see where the fat is. Understand what's essential versus what's habit." "I'll have it to you by Monday," I said, a grim resolve settling over me. That weekend, I built the most comprehensive breakdown of my job I'd ever created. Every inspection coordination, every documentation update, every FAA communication, every maintenance record review, every safety protocol audit, every vendor verification, every insurance report, every system configuration, every emergency procedure test. 412 distinct tasks across a typical month. Some daily, some weekly, some quarterly, some annual. All interconnected, all mandated by federal regulation, insurance policy, or operational necessity. I cross-referenced every single task to its specific FAA regulation or insurance requirement, illustrating the dire consequences of non-compliance for each category. Monday morning, I dropped the report on Marcus's desk. 94 pages, with appendices. He simply stared at the stack. "This is extensive." "You asked for a complete inventory," I replied. "That's complete. Everything I do, why I do it, and what happens if I don't. The regulatory references are in the margin." He flipped through a few pages, clearly not reading. He said he'd review it this week. He didn't. I know because I'd embedded a small notation on page 47, asking him to initial if he'd reviewed that section. A simple test. That page came back and signed 3 months later when HR returned my personal effects after my termination. For the next 6 weeks, Marcus kept pushing. Every conversation circled back to cost reduction. Why monthly maintenance documentation audits? Quarterly would be cheaper. Why did I personally coordinate with FAA inspectors? Let maintenance handle it. Why couldn't we just use standard software instead of my customized tracking system? He wanted justification for every software subscription, every filing system, every process I'd built over 11 years. I answered every question professionally, provided documentation, cited regulations, explained consequences, drew diagrams when verbal explanations didn't register. I even offered to walk him through actual inspection scenarios. None of it mattered. Marcus had already decided that compliance was overhead, not infrastructure. He just needed enough ammunition to justify the cut. My detailed explanations weren't changing his mind, they were just giving him more material to argue against. October brought the quarterly budget review. Marcus presented his optimization plan to the Evergreen executive team via video conference. I wasn't invited, of course, but Emily from HR, a kind soul, filled me in later. Marcus proposed eliminating my position entirely, outsourcing compliance to a consulting firm for about $80,000 annually. Additional maintenance staff would absorb the daily documentation tasks. A net savings of roughly $50,000 annually, factoring in my salary and benefits versus the consulting fees and extra maintenance hours. The CFO asked about risk. Marcus, ever the smooth talker, declared the risk minimal, because aviation compliance was standardized and predictable. Modern software automated most of the tracking. The consulting firm had FAA experience. Everything would be fine. The CEO then asked if anyone on the maintenance team could handle day-to-day documentation. Marcus confidently stated he'd already discussed it with the maintenance director, Robert, and they were confident they could absorb the basic functions with some training. Nobody asked me anything. Nobody reviewed my 94-page report. Nobody contacted the FAA regional office to understand what proper compliance actually required. Nobody talked to our insurance carrier about documentation requirements. They just saw a line item they could cut and decided that was enough information to make the call. November 4th, Tuesday morning. Marcus called me to his office at 9 a.m. An HR representative was already sitting there when I walked in. That's the universal signal that something bad is about to happen. Daniel, we've made some organizational changes. Marcus's voice had that rehearsed, sterile quality executives get when they've practiced delivering bad news. Efficient, but utterly artificial. We're transitioning compliance functions to an outsourced model. Your position is being eliminated, effective November 18th. I just sat there for a second, processing. 11 years. 412 monthly tasks. 0 FAA violations in over a decade. The framed letter from the FAA regional director, all of it dismissed because a guy with an MBA decided compliance was expensive fluff. The HR rep slid a folder across the desk, separation agreement, standard severance, 2 weeks pay plus accrued vacation. Sign here, here, and initial here. I didn't touch the folder. My mind raced. What happens to the compliance documentation system? Marcus shifted in his chair, visibly surprised by the question. Maintenance will handle ongoing documentation. Robert has already been briefed on the transition. The consulting firm will conduct quarterly audits to verify everything's in order. The FAA requires real-time documentation updates for certain maintenance activities, I calmly stated. Quarterly audits won't catch discrepancies until they've already become violations. Marcus's voice took on a defensive edge. That's why we have the consulting firm on retainer. They can address issues as needed. Come in on short notice if something urgent comes up. They can't address issues they don't know about. That's the whole point of continuous compliance monitoring. By the time a quarterly audit catches something, you've potentially got months of accumulated problems. Marcus's jaw tightened. This decision has been made at the executive level. We're not here to debate it. I glanced at the HR rep, she avoided eye contact, staring at the folder as if it held the secrets of the universe. She wanted no part of this. Fine, I said, standing up. I'll need until the end of day Friday to properly transition documentation access. Walk Robert through the system basics. Make sure he knows where everything is. That's reasonable, Marcus said, visibly relieved I wasn't going to make a scene. The maintenance director will coordinate with you on handoff procedures. I walked out. Didn't shake anyone's hand, didn't thank anyone for the opportunity, didn't utter a word about how much I'd enjoyed working there. I just walked back to my desk and started planning. Here's the thing about compliance work, everything is interconnected. Inspection schedules rely on maintenance records. Maintenance records rely on parts tracking. Parts tracking relies on vendor documentation protocols. Pull one thread, and the whole thing begins to unravel. I spent that week doing exactly what they asked. Transitioning documentation access, creating handoff guides, walking Robert through the compliance tracking system, showing him where the files were stored and how the database is connected. What I didn't do was make any of it easy. Every system I'd built over 11 years had my institutional knowledge baked into it. The compliance tracking database had custom fields that only made sense if you understood FAA inspection cycles and how regional inspectors actually requested information. The documentation filing structure followed a logic I'd developed based on years of experience with what worked and what didn't. The vendor management protocols included relationship notes that explained why certain suppliers required different handling based on past interactions. None of this was written down anywhere obvious. It lived in my head, in the way I'd configured systems, in the shortcuts and workarounds I'd developed through a decade of experience, in the intuitive understanding of what regulators actually cared about versus what the formal requirements technically said. I gave them access to everything. Every file, every system, every database, every protocol document. What I didn't give them was context. They got the ingredients, but not the recipe. The parts, but not the assembly instructions. Technically, I fulfilled my transition obligations completely. Practically, I handed them a car with the keys and the ignition, but no manual for how to drive it. Friday afternoon, I packed my desk. 11 years fit into 2 cardboard boxes, photos of aircraft I'd helped keep in the sky, a few plaques from safety conferences, the framed letter from the FAA regional director, personal items that had accumulated over a decade of keeping passengers safe 30,000 feet above the ground. Marcus walked by as I was carrying boxes to my car in the parking lot. He actually stopped, tried to shake my hand as if we were parting on good terms. No hard feelings, Daniel. This is just business. I'm sure you'll land somewhere great. I looked at his outstretched hand, didn't take it. You should check the maintenance documentation protocols before next month's inspection cycle, I said, my voice quiet. The FAA is particularly thorough in Q4. They like to close out the year with comprehensive reviews. I'm sure the consulting firm will handle it, he said, dropping his hand, still smiling, confident in his cost-cutting triumph. Sure. I loaded the boxes into my trunk. Good luck. I drove home. That night, I updated my resume and started reaching out to contacts in the industry. Aviation compliance is a small world, word travels fast. By Monday, I had 3 phone interviews scheduled with other regional carriers who'd heard I was available. What happened over the next 3 weeks, I only learned about later. I pieced it together from Emily in HR, who kept me updated via text messages, from a maintenance tech named David, who I'd worked with for 8 years and who was furious about my termination, from industry contacts who heard rumors, and, eventually, from public records once things got bad enough to make the news. David made it his personal mission to document the collapse, sending me updates almost daily, screenshots of system errors, photos of confused paperwork, quotes from conversations he'd overheard, the whole slow-motion disaster playing out in real time. Week 1 was the honeymoon period. Marcus held a department meeting, announcing the new, streamlined, compliance structure. Maintenance would handle daily documentation. The consulting firm would audit quarterly. Everything would be more efficient, leaner, modern. Robert, the maintenance director who'd been with Ridgeline for 8 years, immediately discovered that my compliance tracking system was far more complex than he'd anticipated. The custom fields didn't match the standard reporting formats he was familiar with from his maintenance background. The cross-references between databases didn't make intuitive sense unless you understood why I'd set them up that way. He spent 3 days just trying to figure out how to generate the weekly inspection summary report, a report that took me 15 minutes every Monday morning, took him most of the week to reconstruct. Marcus told him to figure it out faster. Robert called the consulting firm, asking for emergency guidance. They politely informed him they'd send someone during the next scheduled quarterly audit in January. That was their contract. Anything beyond that would incur additional charges. Marcus, naturally, didn't want to pay additional charges, telling Robert to use Google and the system documentation. Week 2 brought the first actual problem. An FAA inspector showed up for a routine ramp check at our Denver hub. Standard procedure, happens regularly. They pick a random aircraft, inspect its physical condition, and review documentation. The inspector requested the maintenance log for aircraft N447RG, specifically wanting to see the last 3 inspection cycles with parts replacement documentation. A basic request, something I could have pulled up in 30 seconds. Robert couldn't find it. Not because it didn't exist, but because my filing system used a cross-reference structure that linked maintenance logs to inspection cycles to parts inventory. Without understanding that structure, he was searching in the wrong place, looking in the maintenance database when the documentation was actually in the inspection archive with a cross-reference link. The inspector waited 45 minutes, then an hour, then started asking questions about why basic documentation was taking so long. Robert finally called David in to help. David found the file in 20 minutes because he'd seen me pull similar documentation before and remembered approximately where it lived, but the damage was done. The inspector wrote up a documentation discrepancy finding. Not a violation, technically, but a formal notice that documentation wasn't being maintained according to requirements. A flag on the record that would trigger enhanced scrutiny on future inspections. Marcus told Robert to fix it before it became a bigger problem. Robert worked until midnight reconstructing the documentation trail, eventually getting the inspector to note that the records were complete, just disorganized. But the FAA now had a flag on Ridgeline's record. The first crack in the foundation. Week 3 was when things got really interesting. The quarterly insurance audit happened. Our aviation liability carrier sent their risk assessment team to review safety documentation. This was routine, happened every quarter. I'd always prepared a comprehensive compliance package that made the audit take about 2 hours. Pre-organized everything they typically asked for, anticipated questions, had supporting documentation ready. Without that package, the auditors had to dig through raw files themselves, search databases they weren't familiar with, request documentation that wasn't immediately available. The audit that usually took 2 hours took 2 days. They found inconsistencies. Nothing catastrophic on its own, but enough gaps in documentation that they flagged Ridgeline for enhanced monitoring. Our insurance premiums were going up by 12% unless we could demonstrate improved compliance within 60 days. Additional documentation requirements, monthly reporting instead of quarterly. Marcus blamed Robert. Robert blamed the consulting firm for not being available. The consulting firm blamed the transition process and noted that their contract was for quarterly audits, not continuous support. Nobody blamed the decision to eliminate the person who'd kept everything running smoothly for 11 years. Then came the maintenance log issue. Every aircraft requires continuous maintenance documentation. Every part replaced, every inspection performed, every discrepancy noted and resolved. The FAA requires this documentation to be complete, accurate, and current. Gaps in maintenance logs can ground an aircraft until the paperwork is verified. Extended gaps can trigger fleet-wide reviews. My system automatically flagged when documentation was incomplete, little alerts that would pop up if a maintenance action hadn't been properly recorded within 24 hours. I'd configured those alerts to go to my email address so I could follow up immediately with maintenance. My email, that no longer existed. The alerts were still generating, they were just going nowhere, bouncing to a defunct mailbox that nobody was monitoring. For 3 weeks, documentation gaps accumulated without anyone noticing. Maintenance techs were doing their jobs. The physical work was getting done, but the paperwork wasn't getting filed properly because nobody was watching the system that tracked it. By the end of week 3, 7 aircraft had incomplete maintenance documentation, not unsafe aircraft. The maintenance work had been performed correctly, but aircraft where the paperwork didn't match the work performed. And in aviation, paperwork is everything. Without proper documentation, you can't prove the work was done. And if you can't prove the work was done, the aircraft isn't legally airworthy. December 2nd, Monday morning. The FAA regional office called Ridgeline to schedule a comprehensive compliance audit. This wasn't routine. This was triggered by the documentation discrepancy finding from week 2, combined with a tip they'd received about potential maintenance record irregularities. I found out later that tip came from a former Ridgeline pilot who'd heard rumors about the compliance situation through industry contacts and decided to report his concerns to regulators. The audit was scheduled for December 9th, 1 week away. A comprehensive review of all compliance systems, documentation practices, and safety management protocols. Marcus finally panicked. He called the consulting firm, demanding they send someone immediately. Emergency support, whatever it took. The consulting firm said their next available auditor was December 15th, 6 days after the FAA audit. They offered to send someone sooner for a substantial emergency fee, triple their normal hourly rate. Marcus, with a sinking heart, authorized the expense. The consultant arrived December 5th, spent 3 days trying to understand a system they'd never seen before, built by someone they'd never met, configured for requirements they weren't familiar with. By December 8th, the consultant told Marcus they couldn't guarantee the documentation would be ready for the FAA audit. Too many gaps, too little time, too much complexity in the system architecture. Marcus called Robert and told him to fix everything overnight. Robert said that was impossible without understanding how the compliance system worked. Every fix he attempted seemed to break something else because he didn't understand the cross-references. Marcus told him to figure it out or find a new job. Robert called me that night. First time we'd spoken since I left. His voice was shaking. "Daniel, I need help. Desperately." "With what?" I asked, my voice calm, betraying none of the swirling emotions within me. "Everything. The documentation system, the inspection protocols, the FAA audit tomorrow. I don't know how any of this works. And Marcus is threatening to fire me if I can't sort it out overnight." I listened, let him talk. Heard the stress in his voice, the desperation of someone drowning in a system they didn't understand, the fear of someone whose career was about to be destroyed by decisions they didn't make. Part of me felt bad for Robert. He was a good maintenance director. Knew aircraft inside and out. But compliance wasn't his expertise, and Marcus had thrown him into the deep end without a life jacket. But another part of me remembered Marcus calling my work expensive fluff. Remembered 11 years dismissed as fat to be trimmed. Remembered the handshake I didn't take. "Robert," I said, my voice firm. "I'm not employed by Ridgeline anymore. I don't have access to the systems. I don't have authorization to modify documentation. I'm not legally allowed to represent the company to regulators." "I know," he pleaded. "I'm asking as a favor. Please, just tell me what to do. Walk me through it over the phone." I thought about it. Thought about the passengers who flew on those aircraft every day, regular people trusting that someone was paying attention to the details that kept them safe. Thought about the maintenance techs who'd lose their jobs if the airline went under, good people who had nothing to do with Marcus's decisions. Then I thought about how those decisions were made. The executive meeting I wasn't invited to. The 94-page report nobody read. The assumption that my expertise was expendable. "I can't help you for free," I said, the words feeling heavy but right. "And I can't help you on a timeline that makes Marcus look good. If Ridgeline wants my expertise, they can hire me as a consultant." Market rate, $275 per hour. 60-day minimum engagement. Direct reporting to evergreen corporate leadership, not to Marcus. And I need a written acknowledgement that my termination was a business decision that did not reflect on my professional performance. Robert was quiet for a long moment. He's never going to agree to that. Not with the audit tomorrow. Then I guess you'd better start reading the 94-page report I left, I replied, a hint of steel in my voice. Everything you need is in there. Page references to every system, every protocol, every cross-reference. Daniel, please, he begged, his voice breaking. I have a family. If this goes bad, I'm going to lose everything. I understand. And I'm sorry you're in this position. But I'm not the one who put you there. Marcus did. Take it up with him. I hung up. Went back to watching TV. And I didn't feel bad about it. I shouldn't have to feel bad about protecting myself from people who discarded me without a second thought. December 9th arrived. The FAA audit team showed up at 8 a.m. 3 inspectors, a comprehensive document review, aircraft inspections, interviews with compliance personnel. They found problems. 7 aircraft with incomplete maintenance documentation, gaps ranging from 3 days to 3 weeks. 2 aircraft with inspection discrepancies that hadn't been properly resolved and logged. 1 aircraft with a parts replacement that wasn't logged correctly in the tracking system. The compliance tracking system hadn't been properly updated in 3 weeks. Alert emails were bouncing to a non-existent address. The quarterly audit preparation package didn't exist because I'd always created it manually based on institutional knowledge. Robert tried to explain, transition period, new processes being implemented, previous compliance manager left recently. The lead inspector wasn't sympathetic. Your transition period created compliance gaps. Compliance gaps create safety risks. Safety risks ground aircraft. That's how federal aviation regulation works. We don't make exceptions because you're reorganizing. By 2 p.m., the lead inspector had seen enough. She called Marcus into the conference room and delivered the news formally. Ridgeline Regional Airlines was being placed under enhanced surveillance. Effective immediately, all aircraft with documentation discrepancies were grounded until paperwork could be verified and corrected. That was 9 aircraft, almost a quarter of the fleet. Additionally, the FAA was requiring a complete compliance system audit within 30 days. If Ridgeline couldn't demonstrate proper safety management protocols, meeting federal requirements, the entire operation would be reviewed for continued certification. Marcus tried to explain, transition period, new consulting relationship being established, temporary adjustment phase that would be resolved quickly. The inspector cut him off. Mr. Thorne, I've been doing this for 22 years. I've seen every excuse in the book. Your explanations don't change your compliance status. Get your documentation in order, or this situation is going to get worse. By December 11th, the grounding had expanded. More documentation issues were discovered as Robert and the consultant tried to reconstruct records. 12 aircraft total were now sitting on the ground. Flight schedules were being cancelled. Passengers were being rebooked on competitor carriers at Ridgeline's expense. Revenue was hemorrhaging. David sent me photos of the grounded aircraft sitting on the tarmac, 12 planes with red tags on their doors. Millions of dollars in assets that couldn't generate revenue because the paperwork didn't exist to prove they were safe. December 13th, Friday afternoon. My phone rang. Unknown number, but a Colorado area code. Daniel, this is Marcus Thorne. I waited, didn't say anything, let him fill the silence. Daniel, I think we got off on the wrong foot. His voice was different now. Strained. Humble in a way that sounded physically painful for someone with his ego. Ridgeline needs your expertise. We'd like to bring you back as a consultant to help resolve our current situation. I let the silence stretch. 5 seconds, 10, 15. Let him sit in the discomfort of waiting for my response. What situation would that be? I asked, my voice dangerously calm. The FAA has grounded a portion of our fleet pending documentation verification. We need someone who understands the compliance system to help us get back to operational status. Quickly. I thought my compliance system was expensive fluff, I stated, the words like cold steel. That's what you called it, right? Expensive fluff that could be replaced with quarterly consulting and some extra maintenance hours. More silence. I could hear him breathing, probably grinding his teeth, probably wondering how his cost-cutting triumph had turned into this disaster. I may have underestimated the complexity of your role, he finally conceded. A long pause. Look, I'm willing to admit I made a mistake. Can we move forward? Work together to solve this problem? Sure, I said. My consulting rate is $275 per hour, with a minimum 40-hour weekly commitment, 60-day engagement minimum. I require direct reporting authority to Evergreen corporate leadership, not to you. And I need a written acknowledgement that my termination was a business decision that did not reflect negatively on my professional performance. That's not reasonable, Marcus's voice cracked. We can't afford that kind of expense right now. Not with 12 aircraft grounded and revenue down 40% this week. Really? I leaned back in my chair. Because 3 weeks ago you told me that eliminating my position would save $50,000 annually. Seems like a reasonable investment to get a $12 million fleet back in the air. The FAA is being unreasonable, he blustered. This is a paperwork issue, not a safety issue. The aircraft are perfectly safe. Tell that to the federal regulators who grounded them, I countered. Tell that to the passengers who can't fly because your aircraft don't have proper documentation. Tell that to the investors who are watching revenue disappear. Tell that to your insurance carrier, who's probably already drafting premium increase letters. I'm not the bad guy here, Daniel, Marcus's voice got defensive. I was trying to optimize operations. Make the company more efficient. That's my job. Your job created this situation, I said bluntly. You eliminated institutional knowledge to save $50,000, and it's going to cost you millions in grounded aircraft, lost revenue, insurance increases, and regulatory penalties. That's not optimization. That's negligence. He tried a different approach. Daniel, I'm asking you to help people. The employees who are going to lose their jobs if this company fails. The passengers who depend on our service. This isn't about me. It's about them. Then you shouldn't have made decisions that put them at risk. I let that sit for a second. My terms are what they are. Take them or figure it out without me. I hear the consulting firm has someone available now. Maybe they can sort it out with enough time and money. We've already spent $40,000 on emergency consulting fees, and they couldn't fix the system, he exclaimed. That's because they don't understand the system, I stated. I built it. I configured it. I know how it works. That knowledge has value. If you want it, you pay for it. Long silence. When Marcus spoke again, his voice was flat, defeated. I need to take this to corporate. This is beyond my authorization. Do what you need to do, I replied. You have my number. I hung up. Sat there for a minute, feeling something I couldn't quite name. Not vindictive satisfaction, exactly, more like validation. The recognition that expertise matters, that 11 years of careful, methodical work actually meant something. December 16th, Monday morning. A different phone call. Not Marcus this time. Daniel, this is Jonathan Reed, CEO of Evergreen Aviation Holdings. I straightened up in my chair. Mr. Reed, what can I do for you? You can accept my apology for starters. His voice was direct, professional, the kind of tone that suggested he didn't waste time on pleasantries. I've been reviewing the situation at Ridgeline in detail. I've read your 94-page compliance report. I've spoken with the FAA regional office. I've talked to Robert and a consulting firm and several members of the maintenance team. I understand now what happened and why. I'm listening, I said. We made a mistake. Marcus made a mistake. I made a mistake by not scrutinizing his recommendations more carefully. We eliminated a critical function without understanding what it did or why it mattered. The compliance system you built was sophisticated, effective, and apparently irreplaceable on short notice. We didn't appreciate that until it was too late. Okay. I'd like to offer you a position. Not as a consultant, not temporary. As Regional Compliance Director for Evergreen Aviation Holdings, with oversight of all 6 regional carriers in our portfolio. Salary of $145,000 with full benefits and relocation assistance if needed. Direct reporting to me. Authority to build compliance infrastructure across all our operations, however you see fit. I thought about it. 12 seconds. Counted them in my head. What happens to Marcus? Jonathan's voice didn't change. Mr. Thorne's position is being re-evaluated. His decisions at Ridgeline have cost this company substantially more than any savings he projected. The board is reviewing his performance across all areas of responsibility. Good enough for me, I said, a small, knowing smile touching my lips. I'll need the offer in writing before I give you a formal answer. You'll have it by end of day. And Daniel, he added, a hint of genuine appreciation in his voice. Thank you for being willing to consider this. I know we don't deserve your help after what happened. You're right, I replied. You don't. But I care more about keeping aircraft safe than I do about proving a point. The offer arrived at 4:47 p.m. Everything Jonathan had promised, plus a signing bonus that covered the income I'd lost during my unemployment period, stock options, annual bonus potential, the full package. I signed it and returned it by 6 p.m. December 18th. I walked back into the Ridgeline offices as Regional Compliance Director for Evergreen Aviation Holdings. Different badge, different title, same systems I'd built over 11 years. First stop was Robert's desk. He looked up when he saw me. Relief washed over his face like I just told him his house wasn't burning down after all. I'm going to need full access to everything, I told him. All systems, all documentation, all personnel involved in compliance activities. Thank God. He stood up and started gathering files. I've been trying to figure out your filing system for weeks. Every time I think I understand it, something else doesn't make sense. It's not complicated once you understand the logic, I assured him. I'll walk you through it. But first, let's get those 12 aircraft back in the air. Over the next 2 weeks, I rebuilt what they'd broken. I reconstructed documentation for every grounded aircraft, verified maintenance records against physical work orders, updated the compliance tracking system, fixed the email alerts, met with FAA inspectors, and walked them through our corrective action plan. I showed them exactly what had gone wrong and exactly how we were fixing it. The inspectors were professional, thorough, asked hard questions about how we'd prevent this from happening again. I gave them honest answers about organizational changes and new oversight structures. I didn't blame anyone by name, I just explained what we were doing differently. By January 3rd, all 12 aircraft were back in service. The FAA downgraded us from enhanced surveillance to standard monitoring. Insurance premiums stabilized after I submitted a comprehensive compliance report demonstrating restored protocols. January 6th, my first day in the corporate office. Jonathan introduced me at the all-hands meeting for Evergreen leadership. Daniel will be overseeing compliance across all Evergreen regional carriers. His expertise and institutional knowledge are exactly what this organization needs to maintain the highest safety standards. He has my full support and authority to implement whatever changes he deems necessary. After the meeting, one of the other regional directors found me in the hallway. A woman named Sarah who ran the Montana operation. I heard what happened at Ridgeline. The whole story. The VP who fired you and then called begging for help. Marcus Thorne, right? She smiled. Word is he got transferred to our smallest operation in Wyoming. 40 employees, no direct reports, paper-pushing administrative role. Basically a demotion disguised as a lateral move, because firing him would have looked like admitting fault. Couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. She paused, her smile widening. Also heard he has to submit weekly compliance reports to you now as part of the new corporate oversight structure. Is that true? It is, I confirmed. Sarah laughed, a rich, full sound. That's beautiful. The guy who called your work expensive fluff now has to report to the expensive fluff guy. I prefer the term essential operational infrastructure, I corrected with a grin. But yes. January 15th, Wednesday morning. My email pinged with Marcus's first weekly compliance report. 3 pages of documentation that I'd specifically designed to require detailed knowledge of safety protocols. The kind of knowledge you only get from doing the actual work, from understanding why compliance matters instead of just seeing it as a cost center. His report was incomplete. Missing 2 sections entirely, formatting errors throughout, incorrect regulatory citations, the kind of work that showed he still didn't understand what he was looking at. I sent it back with corrections needed highlighted in red, 27 items requiring revision before I could accept the submission. His response came back 4 hours later. He'd fixed most of the issues, but missed 3. I sent it back again, still incomplete. Please review FAA requirements for documentation format and resubmit. His 3rd submission finally passed. Took him all day. The next week was the same, and the week after that. Every Wednesday, Marcus Thorne submitted a compliance report to the man he'd called expensive fluff. February brought the quarterly safety review for all 6 evergreen regional carriers. I presented the consolidated compliance metrics to the executive team, 0 FAA violations across the portfolio since I'd taken over. Insurance premiums trending downward. Documentation system standardized across all carriers. Best compliance performance in company history. Jonathan shook my hand afterward. This is exactly what I hoped you'd bring to the organization. March brought something even better. The FAA regional director reached out personally. Said they'd been monitoring our turnaround. Wanted to feature Ridgeline's recovery as a case study in their next compliance conference. A textbook example of how to rebuild safety culture after organizational failure. I agreed to present. Figured it would be educational. The conference was in Denver. 200 aviation professionals in the audience, FAA officials, airline executives, compliance managers from carriers across the country. I walked through the whole situation, the cost-cutting decision, the elimination of dedicated compliance oversight, the 3-week collapse, the grounding, the recovery. I didn't name Marcus directly, I didn't need to. Everyone in that room knew what happens when you treat safety compliance as a line item to be cut. After my presentation, a guy from the FAA Enforcement Division found me in the hallway. Said they'd been tracking similar patterns across the industry, private equity acquisitions followed by compliance staff reductions followed by regulatory problems. Said my presentation was going to become required viewing for new inspectors. April brought the annual insurance renewal. Our liability carrier ran the numbers on Ridgeline's recovery. Compliance metrics were now better than they'd been before the acquisition. Documentation systems were cleaner. Inspection pass rates were higher. They dropped our premiums by 14%. First time that had happened in the carrier's history for a company that had been under enhanced surveillance less than 6 months earlier. I forwarded the premium reduction notice to Jonathan with a simple note, ROI on the expensive fluff. He wrote back, point taken. Permanently. May brought Marcus's resignation. He'd been in Wyoming for 5 months, 40 employees, windowless office, weekly compliance reports that kept getting sent back for correction. The board had been documenting his performance issues since December, building a case. He quit before they could fire him. Sent a company-wide email about pursuing new opportunities. Nobody believed it. David texted me the news. The expensive fluff outlasted the guy who tried to cut it. Beautiful. Not beautiful, I texted back. Just math. Compliance costs less than catastrophe. Always has. He sent back a laughing emoji. You're no fun. Let me enjoy this. Fine. Enjoy it. So, what about you? Have you ever seen someone's hubris lead to an epic downfall like this? Or have you been the expensive fluff yourself, only to be proven indispensable? Share your stories and thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one.